and you can't run tanks through that. That stalled everything for the moment, but it's absolutely made this a war of logistics, which the Russians aren't great at. So what's going on is the Russians are normally moving everything by train, remember? This black arrow right here pointed up, that's the Kerch Strait Bridge. That is the only rail connection from Russia proper into the southern front. Somebody blew it up a couple months ago. Kerch Strait Bridge, only rail connection between Russia proper and the southern front. So they now have to move everything by truck. You guys remember all those Javelin missiles from earlier in the war? For the most part, the Ukrainians were not using them to target tanks. You know, infantry versus tanks, that's not a lot of fun. So they shot at the trucks. Russia only started the war with about 3,000 tactical support trucks for its entire military. They have lost about 2,300 at this point. So in order to keep things running, because moving things by truck takes about 4 times as long and 10 times as much fuel as doing it by rail, they're having to go back to Russia proper and confiscate things like city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans to shuttle things around the front. Now, you've all seen Scooby-Doo. Imagine the Mystery Machine loaded up with artillery shells. You know, you don't have to get shot at for that to get really exciting. And the explosions that we're seeing on the highways in southern Ukraine are of substance. But the real fun is not here yet. 2 things. Number 1, by the time we get to May, we're going to be in a different sort of conflict. Number 1, all that deferred maintenance will be done, and those 60,000 troops that are training in NATO countries will be back with new gear, probably including some battle tanks. It's a fundamentally different Ukrainian force, order of magnitude more powerful than what they began with last February. Mobile, precision weapons, and a lot of them. But the Russians will have completed their second mobilization, and they will have thrown at least 500,000 more soldiers into this fight, an increase of a factor of 4 from what they began with. Now, yes, they will be badly led and badly equipped and badly trained and with poor gear and low morale. But you know what you call soldiers like that? Russian. There is nothing about the war to this point that is atypical in Russian history. The first year of every Russian war is always a complete and utter shit show. And then they throw bodies at the problem. And in half of those wars, that does it. In the other half, it leads to a government collapse. It's way too soon to know which one of these it's going to be. But by the time we get to May and June, we're going to have a really good idea of which strategy is ultimately going to win in time. Doesn't mean it'll be over in June, but we should have a really good idea. That's number 1. Number 2, Russia has never, ever backed down from any war without one of 2 things happening. Number 1, the government collapses at home. I think the chances of that are minuscule. Number 2, they lose at least 500,000 soldiers to combat. We're at about 100,000 right now. So the Ukrainians either have to attrit 4 times as many forces minimum as they have to this point, which would be bloody to say the word, or they have to trigger a mass fatality event. And they have a way to do that. The Crimean Peninsula is an agricultural zone. Roughly 3 million ethnic Russians live there. But it's all irrigated. 80% of the food production there is with irrigation. This blue line right here, that's the Crimean Canal. Its sluice gate is in Kherson, and the Ukrainians now control it. They're not going to turn it on come planting season. The way Ukraine probably is going to win this war is by triggering a 1980s Ethiopia-style famine in Russian-controlled territory, which is where the best troops that Russia have are currently stationed. One way or another, the scale of this is only beginning to be felt. Okay, that's the tactical, that's the strategic. Let's talk about the economic. If you take everything that Belarus and Ukraine and Russia, the belligerents, do, put into a single bucket. They are collectively the world's largest supplier of the first column, second largest for the second, and so on. I could speak for hours on this one slide. I did so at the CIA for 4 hours back in October. Yeah, that was no fun at all, because they're like asking all these questions, but they won't answer any of mine. When the Soviet system collapsed back in the 1990s, the entire industrial base just went down. But they didn't lose their power generation. Now, the Soviet system was one of the few parts of the world that didn't have access to bauxite, which is the precursor material for aluminum. So what they did in the 90s, since they had all this spare electricity and no industrial production, is they imported all kinds of bauxite from other places, used their spare power to turn it into metal, and then export it. Most of that bauxite came from either Australia or Ireland, two countries that have been relatively enthusiastic about sanctions on the Russian system. So that's shut down. Titanium, the ore comes from Ukraine, it's processed in Russia. So that's gone to zero. You guys remember Brexit? I mean, isn't it hilarious that we don't even think about the Brits anymore? As an American, I really enjoy that. Okay. When the Brits left the EU, they neglected to figure out what was next. And they've come to the conclusion, grudgingly, that the only way that Britain will be a successful economic player moving forward is if they enter into a free trade deal with the North Americans, primarily the United States. We've got some very clear ideas on what they have to do to make that happen. One of the many, many, many things that they're going to have to do is leave the Airbus family of European aerospace companies and join Boeing. This is where it gets fun. Britain's contribution to Airbus are engines and wings. Most of the aluminum from the former Soviet world goes to Airbus. Most of the titanium goes to Airbus. So the future of European aerospace are jets without titanium, aluminum, engines, or wings. Talk amongst yourselves. All right, what else? The blue, neon, and platinum. These are core components in semiconductors. The platinum, the palladium, the rhodium, those are all core materials to regulate electrons. And the neon is used in cartridges which focus the apertures of the etching lasers in the semiconductor fab facilities. Now, neon is made in a two-step process. Step one, you have an air separation unit which is attached to a steel mill. In the former Soviet world, those are almost exclusively in southern Russia. They are all under sanction and they all are barely operating anymore. The second stage is you take your first stage air separation and all the gases that you don't use when you're making steel, so anything that's not nitrogen or oxygen, you put into a canister, you send it off to this more advanced facility, and you separate out all the trace gases: helium, argon, carbon dioxide, neon. Those facilities were in Mariupol, and Mariupol is gone. So we've lost now 70% of global neon, which means in about a year, we have to figure out what we don't need microchips for, because we won't be able to make as many. It's aerospace, automotive, agriculture, satellites, phones. We don't know. Oh, it gets better, because not everyone can make all microchips. We and the Taiwanese and the Japanese and the Koreans, we make the really high-end ones.